if you look real closely, you'll see three distinct color regions. You got this brown, like right here. You got the green out toward the middle. And if you look really, really closely, down between those two hay bales at the far end, you'll see a really dark green patch.
Correct.
And the question then is, why is that different like that? The big difference is where we have organic matter in the soil. Okay, so here on this slope right here, we've had the least opportunity to run our chickens and our cows and sheep. And mostly it's the chickens. You'll see the chicken house on the far side over there. We bring the chickens around in a circuit around this field. It takes about 6 weeks to get around. The chickens have had more time up on that hill, and then as we grow our broiler chickens, we've taken the broiler litter, wood chips and manure, and spread it over there on the top. And as we get closer to that over there, you'll be able to see it's emerald green even in this heat, and the grass is noticeably taller.
Okay, right.
Okay, so we're seeing the effects of the difference in the soil biology, mostly the soil biology. You could argue that as you move down the slope, there's a little bit more moisture just because of the normal migration of the water. Yeah, that's probably true, but even so, the darkest green, best grass is up on the top, not actually down in the bottom.
You would think it'd be at the top because it always gets...
Fertility runs downhill, water goes downhill. So like this brown up here, the least water, the least fertility, this has had the least animal impact right here. These browner places you see are the places where we've had the greatest loss of fertility, the least animal impact to make the grass better. And that kind of leads me to the really big questions about all of this agriculture stuff in the first place. We can listen to many people in the ecological and climate change world talk about how destructive agriculture is, and some of them are saying eliminate all livestock across the world. Aside from the incredible negative impact to many societies, that goes against the basic ecology that has been established on the planet for thousands, millions of years. The animals are part of the normal carbon cycle. They need to be there in order for it to work right. But we have this incredibly destructive thing that we do in agriculture, which affects three really big things as we know agriculture right now. The first one is desertification. If you were to go look at some of Alan Savory's stuff, you would see he has this Mercator projection of the world map where he has outlined the brown spots around the world. They're bigger. The brown spots are 50% bigger than all the green spots. And most of those deserts represented by those brown spots are in fact man-made. They are created by agriculture. The way we use our croplands, the way we use our animals has been destructive. And the evidence is very clear about that. One of the ways we can see just how destructive it is by studying erosion. When we look at erosion, we can ask the question, where does the eroded soil go? Well, it goes down the water courses and it ends up in the bays and the lakes around the world. David Montgomery at, I believe it's Washington State University, I'm not 100% sure of his affiliation at this point, in a book called Dirt, The Erosion of Civilization, talks about studying the cores from all of these places and looking at the history of agriculture, the history of the land through those cores. And it tells an incredibly devastating tale. It used to be called the Fertile Crescent. The Bible refers to the area as the land of milk and honey. What we know of that particular area today, that would be Iraq, Jordan, Israel. Those places today are deserts. Why would they be referred to like that? Fertile Crescent, land of milk and honey. And the answer is, before we eroded the soils so badly, they were much more productive than they are today. Multiple different things have happened there. One is erosion. The other is irrigation, bringing salts up through the soil by years upon years and decades and centuries upon centuries of irrigation. This is a normal thing. We've seen it out in California as the salts rise up through the soil in response to irrigation. The National Resource Conservation Service, used to be called the Soil Conservation Service, has been saying for years and years. I remember as a teenager reading this in Progressive Farmer years and years ago. We have this much time left before we literally run out of topsoil. And at that point in the 1970s, early 1970s, they were talking about losing 7 feet, 7 whole feet of topsoil in places like Iowa and Nebraska. Can you imagine eroding 7 feet of topsoil off the land? Where would that soil be if it actually happened? Well, it would end up in the Gulf of Mexico. If you go to the mouth of the Mississippi River in the Gulf of Mexico today, what do you find? Well, you guess what? You find the soil that used to be in Iowa, that used to be in Nebraska. It's a dead zone out there. The size, it used to be Rhode Island, now it's Connecticut. So it's growing, and it is a direct response to the way we do agriculture. So we need to begin to think differently about stuff. The National Resource Conservation Service is telling us that right now we probably run out of topsoil, not in the United States, but worldwide in 2060. Guess what? This is 2023. That is not very far away. That's 37 years. 37 years before we're out of topsoil. What happens when we run out of topsoil? That means crop production plummets. That kind of leads us into the next big section of major problems facing agriculture, and that's consolidation. As a small producer, for instance, we have the difficulty of trying to get our chickens processed, get our beef processed, get our lambs processed. We have to schedule out a year in advance and sometimes more just to be able to get into someone who can give us USDA inspected meat. Why? Because depending upon who you talk about, I'm just going to say 8. There are approximately 8 conglomerates today that control all of the processing in the country. And the mom and pop locker plant that used to exist in virtually every town of any size at all, a couple thousand people and up, does not exist anymore. You can drive down to Jacksonville, you can see the old locker plant. It's all closed up and falling apart. And you can see that repeated all across the state of Texas. And it's not just Texas, it's around the country. Well, that consolidation makes maybe things more efficient. And you have to ask the question, at what point does efficiency become a negative? When efficiency becomes a negative, that's the point of reducing resiliency. And we saw this in the COVID lockdowns. The big meat processors had all kinds of people out. They had all kinds of shutdowns in their plants. And what happened on the store shelves? People could not find meat. Shelves were bare. Why? Not because small producers like me didn't have things, but because the big producers could not flow this stuff through their system. We went so efficient that we became fragile, brittle, easily broken. We want to do better. We need to be thinking about how to find the balance between efficiency and resiliency. It is not where we are today. It's somewhere back away from the consolidation that we're seeing right now. And the move toward consolidation is continuing. The way the federal laws are written, they are skewed, biased toward large producers rather than the small producer. For instance, to be USDA inspected, you have to have an inspector on site when you process. If you are a small operation and you have to pay for that inspector to be in your building for 30 cows, that's a very different thing than having an inspector on site to do 3,000 cows. Spreading those costs across 30 versus 3,000, lots and lots of difference there. The last one I referred to earlier, and that's the desertification. So the big three: desertification, consolidation, and erosion. So now we ask the question: so what do we do about it? Can we just sit on our hands and hope we all die peacefully? Nah, I don't think so. There are ways to approach this problem, and people like Alan Savory, Joel Salatin, Gabe Brown, and a number of others have talked about how to do things differently. Alan Savory particularly points out, he says, we don't need new technology. We need to change the way we think. Specifically, we need to change the way we manage. And the interesting thing about changing the way we manage is that it may be the hardest of all problems to solve. Stop and think about it. If I offer you a new gadget, ooh, cool, this is a neat new gadget, I like it, and we play with the new gadget. But if I say, you need to change the way that you behave, you go, why? I don't think so. This has always worked for me. And the answer is that changing people's mindsets is a huge, huge problem. Part of it is that these processes work so slowly that in one generation you cannot really see it. But over the course of 3 or 4 generations or 1,000 years, you can see the effects in a very pronounced way. So once upon a time in Rome, we would call them peasant farmers today. A man lived on the farm with his wife and his kids, and they produced enough food off of their small plot to feed themselves and to sell to make money. And they were very prosperous. The population, as a result, rose because they could feed more people. This is great. As the population rose, the demand for more food came, and they responded by producing more food. But at the same time, they began to cut corners as the pressure got a little bit more intense. Well, I'm not going to do this year because I don't have time to do that. I need to do this. Next thing you know, the land starts to degrade in its ability to produce. They move up the hill to the next most fertile place, and the process goes up the hill, up the hill, up the hill, up the hill, until finally they're on the sides of mountains. And of course, as you move up the hill, the erosion potential goes up. And again, these are things that can be seen in the silt in the bottoms of lakes and bays. This is not something that you can't go find the papers and the scientific evidence to document. So there came a point when the farmer in Rome could no longer feed himself and his family. So what did that farmer start to do? They said, I can't feed my family. So they began to sell their properties and move to the cities. When they did that, now there's nobody farming the land, and all of a sudden you got a problem. Dr. Montgomery says this is probably the roots of serfdom in Europe right here, because at that point Rome passed a law that said you, Mr. Farmer, and your family cannot leave the farm unless we, the government, give you permission. Okay? So now the farmer, while technically not a slave, belonged to the land. And if that person sold the land to someone so that they could eat, they couldn't move. They had to stay with the land unless they got permission to leave. And this is exactly the way serfdom worked throughout Europe. So not a good deal. So what do we do in response to all this? Well, some of the things that we can do, we can change the way we manage. So what we do here is we use our animals to actually put fertility back into the soil. We don't use any chemicals. We use the animals to do that job for us. Some of the other things that get involved with that, so with these things, there's the corollary issue of soil depletion. Soil depletion is not so much about nutrients not being there, it's more about nutrients not being available to the plants. Well, that asks the next question is, how do the nutrients become available to the plants? Well, it turns out that that's all about the life in the soil. When we started this farm in 2019, we dug a hole in the ground, and the soil was a uniform gray-brown all the way down to, foot down. Now, I've got 1.5 inches, in some places over 2 inches, of black stuff on top of that gray soil. What is that black stuff? If you look at it, it's organic matter that has been put down by what we're doing. It wasn't there to start with. We've managed to create that as we've moved through. The other thing is that we stopped using chemicals, no chemicals at all. If you take pesticides and herbicides, they end in CIDE. That is very familiar ending to words. That goes with homicide, fratricide, patricide, infanticide. All of these things mean to kill. You put these pesticides and herbicides on the land, and they may kill the thing that they're targeted at killing, but they also kill more. For instance, I grew up in South Texas on a ranch, and I can remember dung beetles all over the place pushing their little balls around. And out here, it was like these manure piles are just turning into shingles. There's nothing happening to them. What's wrong here? And I began to look, and there wasn't a dung beetle on the place, not a one. About 2.5 years after we stopped spraying any chemicals on the place, all of a sudden I saw a dung beetle. My wife could tell you how excited I was that I found a dung beetle. It was a big day. Now I could see visible sign of life coming back into the soil. And now we can see, in various places, we can see the fungi, and we can see the evidence of the bacteria in the soil. So it's making a difference as we move through. Small producers are basically the antithesis of consolidation. In terms of resiliency, if something happens to my farm, the guy a mile down the road may not have had that happen to his farm, or the lady 2 miles to the north may not have had that happen to her farm. So this localized problem, very small disruption in the grand scheme of things. With consolidation, one of these big meat processors goes down, and the whole country is now shocked because stuff is not happening. 2 of them go down, it's not a little shock, it's a big shock. 3 of them go down, now it's a disaster. So building resiliency back in, from my perspective, is fundamentally about decentralization. Decentralization, for me, is about small producers doing well, being able to make a living as a small producer. And what do you need for a small producer? You need land that you can take care of yourself. You need to be able to process the things that you grow. I have some friends who are hemp growers, and they want to process their hemp for fiber. Well, where's the fiber processor for hemp? They're somewhere, but they're not around here. And so it's not just livestock processing, it's processing on many different dimensions where we are really consolidated, but we don't have the localized stuff to help the small producer make the system more resilient. Now, do you have any questions?
I have a couple.
I've talked a lot.
Oh no, you're fine. I have a couple questions. One, why do you move your livestock around from quarter to quarter to quarter? So you won't just overgraze one area?
The idea is that we want to graze the grass down and to maybe 4 or 5 inches tall, because we're running Bahia grass, Tifton 85, Coastal Bermuda, and Common Bermuda for the most part in our pastures. This one out here to my left is all Bahia, and that's about the minimum height for that plant to stay healthy. We want to let the animal come in, eat that down, pee, poop, and leave. This is the way a herd out in the natural world would work. With the pressure from predators, they'll bunch. Then, when the food is exhausted at the spot where they are, they'll move to the next place. But because they've been concentrated, they've taken the plants down, they've trampled some down, but they've also walked over their manure, and they've used their hooves to work that into the ground, which helps to feed that upper layer of life in the soil. By trampling stuff down, they've put thatch onto the soil. Both of those work together to basically put an armor plating on top of the soil to protect the soil from the sun and from the impact of a direct rain strike. So if you were to watch a droplet of rain hit like this dry dirt at my feet, it would look like a bomb just went off. You'd see this crater develop and water droplets go out like so, and then the crater would collapse on itself and you'd have this big jet coming up. Well, what happens when you do that is the soil particles become mobile, and you just increase the erosion likelihood. Well, not likelihood, you've increased the erosion, period. So by having thatch on top of that, the dirt is not directly impacted by that raindrop. The raindrop's force as it falls from the sky is broken and scattered so that it gently comes to the soil. The other thing is that it turns out that the life in the soil does not particularly appreciate ultraviolet radiation. I mean, like my skin does not particularly appreciate ultraviolet radiation. Get too much of it, I'm going to get skin cancer. The soil gets ultraviolet radiation, and it literally kills the bacteria and the fungi in that upper layer of the soil. Ultimately, it just sterilizes the soil. If you sterilize the soil, you no longer have the mechanism to make the nutrients in the soil bioavailable. Charles Massey from Australia talks about drug addict plants, and he says we've killed the soil, we've killed the life in the soil to the point where the only way that a plant can survive is by us giving them a hit of their preferred narcotic, which nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So yeah, we can do better. So by protecting the soil, by the way we move the animals, we take care of the land itself. There's a secondary effect also, and that is by moving the animals, we break the life cycles of many of the parasites that the animals encounter, like intestinal worms. We have very few intestinal worms here. Every year and a half or 2 years, we might have to give somebody a shot of something, but by and large, the animals take care of themselves. They just don't get sick. And that's because they're moving, and by moving, the parasites do not get a chance to grow to the point where the livestock is eating them back in and making the next life cycle in their intestine. Likewise, by using multi-species, the cattle disrupt the life cycle of the sheep parasites, and the sheep parasites, the sheep interrupt the life cycle of the cow parasites, and the chickens eat bugs. And when I say they eat bugs, in the morning when we move, the chickens will bunch up in the direction that I'm moving to get the new round of grasshoppers. But additionally, if there are cow piles in their path, they will scratch those cow piles apart, and they will eat fly larvae out of those cow piles. So they become a major insect control mechanism for us, and we didn't spray a thing.
So how are you able to stay so organic all the time? Just by your farm naturally running itself?
Just letting the animals move is the biggest deal, and moving them at the appropriate time. That's like on Monday, we will bring the cattle and the sheep out of the grazing unit over there and over into this paddock. This paddock has been resting for, it's been 40 days now, I think, since we baled hay. So we'll pick up these bales of hay and get them out of here and bring the cattle back out. This is the best grass on the farm right now. And this was, as I say, baled for hay about 40 days ago.
Okay. wanted to ask you, where do you get your animals from?
I bought my Mashona cattle from a farm down in Waller, Texas. I can't remember the name of the place, but the Mashona cattle particularly come from the south central part of Africa, and they are natively adapted to high heat and high humidity and rough forage. Those are all the kinds of things that a grass farmer looks for. They are also pest resistant and parasite resistant. Not immune, but resistant. It's like if you go look at the flies on one of my Mashonas and compare the Mashona to one of the half Hereford, half Angus, there'll probably be twice as many or 3 times as many flies on the British breed as opposed to the Mashonas. They just don't like them as well. The Katahdin sheep likewise are parasite and pest resistant. They are hair sheep rather than wool sheep, so we don't have to worry about having to shear them in the springtime. They are also able to survive very, very well and get fat on rough forage. Right now, it is so hot that I have not mowed the weeds out of my pastures over here, and that's strictly to let those weeds be shade for my grass to help hold some of the moisture to keep the soil temperature from getting up as high as it might.
It is very hot out here.
It is.
I wanted to ask you, I know we were talking about COVID-19 earlier. I was wondering, how did that affect your farm a lot, or was it just the major producers?
It didn't really affect us very much directly, but it did affect us indirectly. One of our primary sales channels is the Rose City Farmers Market. Rose City Farmers Market shut down in 2020 out of concerns for COVID. That took, a very significant means of earning a living away from us for an entire year. We had to rely almost exclusively on online sales. And at that point, our online sales were very, very early on in their very early fledgling state. So we would deliver to Houston one week, and then we would deliver to Dallas the next week. And we were able to do that with a basically no contact methodology. We pulled up, carry the stuff to somebody's front door, ring the doorbell, and then walk away, so that we were never in, not even 6 feet. We were 50, 100 feet away from the nearest person when we made that transfer, and we did that for several years. Fuel prices just went up last year, so we stopped delivering as much to.
What is this?
I'm not sure what that bug is.
No. Oh, it's gone now.
Yeah. It can bother me. Yeah. So there's a lot there.
Well, do you think that when the COVID happened, were you ever nervous about it, or do you lead to shut down when necessary?
The first thing that I thought about when they started talking about shutting down for COVID, I told my wife and family that the effects of the shutdowns were going to be far worse than the effects of the illness, and that has proven to be true. A lot of people can argue that the shutdowns were very, very positive. I'm not sure that I would agree with that. Everybody's entitled to their opinion, but the evidence as I see it says that we created far more damage than we needed to create. From my perspective, masking was a pretty effective way of mitigating the risk, but shutting things down and depriving people of their livelihoods, the ripple effects throughout the economy are still with us today. And now it's 2023 and not 2020. It's huge. For a week, people can sustain it. For 2 weeks, it's starting to get tough. But for multiple weeks and months, man, could you imagine? Lots and lots of people did crazy stuff at that point in time just to survive. And as a result, we had a bunch of very large federal incentive programs launched. Just from a pure fiscal perspective, the idea that we will simply turn on the Mungie printers and make more money to finance this thing that we want to do, economically there's a problem with that. I understand the reasons why we did it, and I'm glad that we did. I just am still of the opinion that it's probably something that was not necessary. We could have done things that were more effective than we did. That's hindsight, but I did in fact say that to my family like the day they announced the shutdowns. This is going to be bad. I actually was concerned that we might have armed insurrection as people got hungry. We didn't get that far, thankfully. The federal government put out their support programs. Otherwise, it was very likely have been like the mob riots in Rome when they got hungry. That would not have been a pretty sight.
It would not have been. Would not have been. I know we had talked earlier at the farmers market about the vaccine.
Yeah, the vaccines. I'm fully up on my vaccines. I am more concerned about the vaccines today than I was at the time. As I've learned more about mRNA, I'm a little bit less sanguine about it. mRNA is literally a piece of genetic material that alters the way our genetic machinery does its job. And the really scary part is that mRNA doesn't degrade, it accumulates. This is kind of like mercury in a top-level predator. For instance, let's say a bluefin tuna. One of the issues for eating top predators in many lakes and oceans is that the mercury from the lowest level has been concentrated by each successive species that was consumed by the predator above them. Well, we are apex predators ourselves. And that means that mRNA that is used to do something on a vegetable or on a piece of fruit or injected into a cow or a sheep or a hog or a goat or a chicken, that stuff is going to accumulate in us. And the really scary part is we don't know what it will do. We cannot say with any level of certainty that it's harmless. If we've learned anything, I would hope that we've learned that many of the things that we said, oh, this is harmless and it won't do anything bad to us, only to have the stuff show up later as carcinogenic or otherwise was mutagenic and just plain bad. There was a drug that was used for colic in the late 50s, I think it was, and early 60s, that resulted in multitudes of babies being born with only buds for their limbs. Sometimes they would just abort. That's mutagenic. And then the carcinogenic stuff, we got the beautiful glyphosate that was supposed to break down in the environment that doesn't. It's now in the air we breathe. It's in the rain that falls. It's in the food we eat. And every one of us is walking around with glyphosate in our brains and all of our internal organs. But it was safe. Not so much. And the rise of the use of all of these chemicals has an unbelievably good correlation to the rise in things like autism and Parkinson's and other diseases like that, particularly of the nervous system. You have to ask yourself the question, what have we done to ourselves? And you can ask the question by way of just, you could call it an anecdotal proof. Do these kinds of things exist in places where they've not used so many chemicals? What is their experience? Are they having the same level of rise in Parkinson's and autism that we have here? Could you actually draw the conclusion that the use of those chemicals, as it differs between place to place, is actually resulting in poorer health where they use more of them? I think you can. I know I personally am willing to make that conclusion. It's an amazing thing.
What-
At the bottom line, you ask the question, is there hope? If I did not believe there was hope, we wouldn't be out here doing what we're doing on this farm, and we wouldn't be having this conversation today. I'd just be over in a corner crying somewhere. We have an opportunity to change the game. That begs the question, how on earth can you change the game? There are really two answers to that question. The first answer is for the producers. For the producers, take the time to learn about this thing called regenerative agriculture. There are lots of different voices out there about regenerative agriculture today, each one with a slightly different twist. I will say something that I've said many times myself and that I've heard echoed by people like Savory and Salatin. The principles never change. The principles never ever change. But from an engineering perspective, you have to process the initial conditions and boundary conditions. What that means in layman's terms is you have to take your local conditions, your local context into consideration, and take those principles and adapt them to right where you are, what you're doing, what your goals are. The second thing is, as a consumer, I will determine by what I buy what gets produced. If I buy X, then somebody's going to say, oh, they like X, make more X. But if we say, oh, no, Y is the proper thing to buy, and we stop buying X and start buying Y, guess what? X stops getting produced, not immediately, but over time, X production will go down and Y production will go up. As consumers, the way I spend my food dollar or any other dollar will change what the people who are manufacturing and producing things actually deliver. So you can change the world, I can change the world, literally one bite at a time, one purchase at a time. It's as straightforward as that. The thing is that if we do not together move in those directions, if we say, oh no, I'm going to vote strictly with my wallet, that's the only concern that I have, then nothing changes.
What a cute doggy.
That's Thor. Please don't pet him. He's a guard dog. He's lobbying to become a house dog, but we don't want him to do that. We need him to take care of the sheep.
Okay. I got you.
But he's sweet. Aren't you, Thor? Yes.
I do want to ask you, do you think it's a lot to do with people not being aware of how their body? You think a lot of people don't care about their bodies? 'Cause I think people know not to eat fast food, but they still eat it.
I think that people give lip service to caring about their bodies. I think mostly they care about how their bodies look, not how their bodies are. And there's a huge difference between those two things. You know, I can go to the gym and I can tone up and get buff, have a rock hard belly and have ripples all over. That's great. But that does not speak to what is going on in the biochemistry of my brain, the biochemistry of my liver, of my stomach. One of the more interesting things that I've seen really starting to come to the front over the last 2 to 3 years is the relationship between our gut biome, the bacteria in our guts, and our brain health. It's like, excuse me? No joke now. They're actually making pills of human excrement to give to people who have mental disorders because they're essentially concentrating the bacteria from the gut biome and giving it to people to jumpstart those people's gut biomes because they've found that this relationship is very, very real. If your gut is unhealthy, you probably feel unhealthy. You probably don't think as well as you could. You probably don't process your food as well as you could. You probably just don't function anywhere close to your potential. So ingesting all these chemicals, guess what? Pesticides and herbicides, once again, we're killing the bacteria. Just like in the soil, we're killing it in our guts now. result is just as bad. A lack of bacteria in our guts means that we don't break down our foods correctly. It means that the micronutrients that these different species might be processing out to feed our cells don't get processed. Charles Massey again has a really good set of diagrams talking about how these things correlate with one another, and the correlation is a better correlation than the correlation between lung cancer and nicotine. It is unbelievable, and yet we ignore it. Because again, we care about how our bodies look, not how our bodies are, and those two things are worlds apart.
You think we ever get to a point where everybody's on the same page of trying to eat healthy for the better world? Because I mean, you think about we overproducing, don't you think?
We produce more food than the world consumes, and I have heard a number of people say that is not true because we've got people starving here, we've got people starving there.
Depending where they're at.
And if you look, you find that there's all kinds of food spoiling here, spoiling there, rotting over here, and you have to ask the question, well, if that's the case, how come people are starving to death? And the answer is really very simple. Throughout human history, food has been used as a weapon. It has been used as a way of coercing people to your will. So someone says, you will give us that stuff or we will starve you. You will do what we told you or we will starve you. You know, whatever the case, you will bend to our will or we will starve you. And it's happening around the world today. If you go to the Sudan, you go to Ethiopia, it's not a food availability problem. There's lots and lots of food available, but distribution is a problem. At the same time, agricultural practices enter in. So if we look at, well, let's take a historical example. China, 1959 to 1959, 1960, 1961, as many as 55 million people died of starvation. They resorted to cannibalism. Why? They changed their agricultural practices that had worked for millennia and took the latest and greatest thing, modernizing, and it totally disrupted everything about the way their ecosystem worked. Same thing I said earlier. The principles are always the same, but you have to make sure you adapt the principles to your local context, to your local conditions, and they didn't. The result was famine. They've recovered since then, thankfully. But you look at places like Ethiopia and Sudan, these places are in very brittle environments. That is, places where you get rain for a little bit out of the year and then you don't get rain. So like in Zimbabwe, where the Mashonas come from, it rains 4 months out of the year. 4 months. And then for 8 months, it doesn't rain. You know, we think we're dry right here, right now. How long have we been without rain? Since about the end of June. So we're coming close to 60 days. That's nowhere close to 8 months. 2 months. And so, can you imagine what this place would look like if we went for 8 whole months without a drop of rain? Those environments have to be taken care of very carefully, but they can be taken care of if you use your animals in the right way. Using the animals in the right way starts between our ears, but it can also be influenced by, as I said, people trying to impose their will on other people. If you say, if you go there, we will kill you. If you do that, we will starve you. And all of that results in people doing things that are damaging to the land. And you go over there and you look and you can see that the line of the Sahara is creeping downward, well down into the Sudan and into Chad and into the northern part of Niger. It's just creeping down little bit by little bit every year. People have tried to go in and plant, $1 billion worth of trees and stuff like that. The trees just get cut by the sand and dry up, and they're gone. The way to recover that stuff, when you use the animals the right way, you can begin to move that edge of that desert back a little bit at a time, but steadily move it back by causing grass to grow. Most people don't even think about carbon sequestration and grass in the same sentence, maybe not even the same paragraph or the same book.
I don't know what that is.
Carbon sequestration, capturing the carbon dioxide out of the air and holding it so that it's no longer a greenhouse gas.
Okay. That's smart.
Guess what? A healthy grassland can contain more carbon than a rainforest, and it will do it faster. I mean, how fast does grass grow? How fast does a tree grow? A mature tree, 25 years. Mature grass, 1 year. Okay. Over time, grasses, it's like, there are places in the United States where you can go and find grass that is over 8 feet tall. And I believe the number I saw was 12 feet. I mean, that's hard for me to grass, 12 feet tall. As a matter of fact, I know that you can find it because, like, cane along some of our creeks, it is actually a grass. You can see that it's 12 to 15 feet tall. Cane is a grass. But things like big bluestem and some of the other grasses that used to inhabit our prairies grew to these enormous heights. The Soil Conservation Service in the early part of the 20th century went out into the prairie and dug a great big hole in the ground to see how far down the roots of the grass went. How deep did they go?
At least 10, 15 feet.
How about 25?
The roots.
The roots. So now you got a grass plant that's 6 to 12 feet tall and 25 feet of roots in the ground. So in terms of vegetable matter, that's a lot of vegetable matter. And all of those roots down in that soil are doing something that is, every time I talk about it, I'm just amazed. The plants are in a barter economy with the microbes and fungi in the soil. They're actually trading, actively trading. The plant does this magic thing. It snatches carbon dioxide out of the air, mixes it with a little bit of sunshine. Can you do that? I can't do that. And says, okay, have some sugar and some other carbs. And the bacteria and the fungi, especially the fungi has these things that look like roots growing through the soil. They're called hyphae. And they will actually tap into the root of the plant. And the plant and the fungus will exchange stuff. The fungus will bring bioavailable minerals like copper and selenium and phosphorus and nitrogen and all the rest of the stuff to the plant, as long as the plant supplies it with sugar and carbs. The fungus says, if you feed me, I'll feed you. How about that? And the plant says, here's your stuff. And it's been demonstrated in laboratory settings that this is actually an active exchange. This is not a passive thing, it's actually active, which again just blows me away. You know, sometimes I think about that the earth is actually one giant organism, and that we human beings and other life forms are like the organelles in our own cells. It's an interesting thing to think about that way, and it helps frame some stuff. But
I always felt like the humans, well, people are like, I won't say like parasites, but I feel like the earth, I feel like the world would survive on it. If all the humans went away, I feel like the world would replenish itself.
I think that's exactly what would happen. I think that when stuff gets out of kilter, like we could argue that it's getting out of kilter right now, that the earth simply shrugs. And when the earth shrugs, stuff happens, you know. On the human scale, that stuff is destructive and disastrous. As far as the planet's concerned, it's just putting stuff back the way it needs to be. At times, the planet's been a lot hotter than it is today. At times, it's been a lot colder. We, as especially civilized humans, have not experienced those cycles. Humans as a species have, Humans were alive and well in the last ice age. They managed to migrate around the world even with the ice on the planet, and then they adapted to the warming conditions after the ice retreated. Okay, so, we can be pretty resilient, but even so, there's, I think it's called the Dogger Banks between the Netherlands and England. It's a shallow extension out from the Netherlands. Nobody ever thought much about it. Nobody thought much about sea level rise. But if you go to the Dogger Banks today, they have found human habitations out in the ocean that used to be on dry land. I mean, we didn't live underwater.
True.
Those Dogger Banks were dry land at one point, and people lived well out into what's like 60 or 100 feet of water today. That's how much sea levels have changed. What did it mean? It means those people had to move or die. And today, with 8 billion people on the planet, as the sea levels rise, what is going to happen to people? They're going to move or die. And those of them that can move, which will be the vast majority, will. That will then put pressure on all the rest of society to absorb them. Likewise, what happens as you magnify desertification? People can't make a living in the desert environment. What do? They migrate. We're seeing people migrate out of desert areas, whether that's out of the Middle East or elsewhere, to places that are more benign with their climate, like the United States, like Europe. And in both places we see people getting all up in arms about immigration. Now this immigration is, in my opinion, a symptom of what we have done to ourselves. This is not because this people group doesn't like us or that people group doesn't like us. They're just trying to live. And
I can see that.
So we can make a difference by what we do. First as a consumer, we'll do it in reverse order. As a consumer, by what I buy, by what I eat, I can change things there. As a producer, by how I manage, whether I'm growing vegetables or I'm growing fruits or I'm growing livestock, by how I manage. The most effective, some of the most effective places I've seen in any of the stuff that I've looked at are places where they've integrated fruit and vegetable production with their animal production. So if we take Ridgedale Permaculture up in Sweden, this guy is at 59 degrees latitude north. I mean, we're not far from the Arctic Circle there. And he's got 25 acres in his farm there. And when he was going full bore, they were doing something like $300,000 a year off that little farm. They had cattle, they had sheep, they had pigs, they had chickens for meat, chickens for laying eggs, and they had probably 5 or 6 full acres of the most beautiful garden you could imagine. They used the animals to put life back into their soil, and then with the chicken litter and manure from the cattle and the pigs, they made compost that they used for their garden, and the whole thing was basically a closed cycle. It's still going today, and it's just a phenomenal operation, just phenomenal. I'm not as good as Richard Perkins. I wish I were. The guy's got enough energy for 5 people. My hat's off to him. He's done a great job up there. Gabe Brown up in North Dakota. North Dakota is not like Texas. I mean, it gets cold up there. It's almost as flat as a pancake. Nothing between them and the North Pole but a couple of twigs, and they might be broken down. And yet, he's got these absolutely lush fields, and you can look on either side of the fence between him and his neighbor and see the difference. Lush green stuff, whether it's corn or it's this cash crop or that cash crop, next to practically desert. And we're talking North Dakota now. And the big difference is that Gabe has been farming regeneratively for over 20 years now. He said that their soil has so much organic matter in it now, over 7%, that they can absorb water from rainfall at the rate of something like 32 inches an hour. I mean, 32 inches an hour, that's that much rain in an hour soaking into the soil, not running off. Can you imagine? That is some seriously absorptive soil. And that is all because he's taken the time to build the life back into the soil. They also do he raises cash crops. Okay, great. He raises cash crops. He does it no-till, so he disturbs the soil surface very, very little. And he always has a cover crop, so the land is never naked. Protected from the wind, protected from the rain, protected from the sun at all times.
What would be considered a cover crop?
You might consider clover a cover crop, or any number of low-growing grasses that don't get up into your cash crop, let's say corn, but at the same time keep the ground covered and protected. And by doing that, the soil temperature can be as much as like 40 degrees or more difference in temperature, covered and uncovered. That's a lot of difference in soil temperature. And you can imagine if soil temperature gets up, 140, 150, 160 degrees on a hot day, that the life in the soil just got cooked. Not good for it.
So I wanted to ask you, with everything going on and the heat we've been having, how are you able to keep everything? Is it just because you're moving animals around, or just because you've been working overtime to keep your farm together?
Part of it is by having land that has grass on it. So the temperature is lower over the grass than it is over bare ground. So we've taken some of the heat load off by just making sure that the land is covered. The next thing is, like for the chickens, you see that house is white. And you look at our other chicken stuff out there, they're white, with the exception of this one right here. It's silver. The reason that we did that material is called PAL roof. It is a plastic roofing material. The best possible material that we could get for that would have been aluminum. Aluminum has a property called, all properties have a property called emissivity, and aluminum has a particularly low emissivity. And what does emissivity mean? Emissivity means that when the sun hits the top side, you can't feel the heat on the bottom side. So if I were to put a piece of steel out here, sun hits the top side, I'd nearly cook my hand on the bottom side. I wouldn't be touching it, 6-10 inches away. It'd still be hot. Aluminum, sun hits the top side, and you can't feel the heat coming off of it. It stops. So it's not emitting infrared radiation the way that other materials do. Well, we couldn't find any aluminum siding to use for that job. The next best thing was this PAL roof. And when we put it on, I actually crawled inside the chicken tractor and let myself feel the difference in the temperature on a hot day inside versus outside, and it's profound. It's also very low emissivity, not as low as aluminum, but it's low. In this broiler right here that has the silver on it, we have that's a broiler pen. The other pens have layer chickens in them. The layer chickens are more robust and more hardy than the meat chickens. And the meat chickens were stressed because of the heat. We even lost a few of them. So we came back and we used some radiant heat barrier, which is an aluminized material. So we couldn't get aluminum siding. We got the next best thing in aluminum, which is the radiant heat barrier. And we covered the PAL roof with that radiant heat barrier. So now we have 2 layers of radiant heat barrier to work through to get to the chickens, and the chickens are okay now. And it just, it reduces the temperature, 5 to 8 degrees inside there just by taking the solar load off. It's like if we walk over here, We feel the sun right here.
Correct.
We walk over here into the shade. We instantly feel much cooler just because we lost the solar load.
We did.
That's a radiant heat load from the sun. And that same principle applies for all of the animals. The Mashonas and the Katahdins are adapted to hot climates. They can deal with the hot climates. The Mashonas especially, it can get to be routinely 120 degrees in the middle of Zimbabwe. And in the wet, not only is it hot, but it's humid. Really, really humid. Nasty conditions.
Even with rain.
Yeah. So, and then as it dries out after the wet, now you've got this sauna situation, and these animals are adapted to that. They were, from our perspective, a very good choice. They fit with what we wanted on this farm. The size of the animal fits with what we want to do. The characteristics of the animal for heat and pest resistance, all that stuff, fit with what we want to do. So we've chosen to use genetics rather than chemicals to do the bulk of the work for making our animals healthy. And then by doing what we do with the rotation, we enhance that by making the soil itself healthier in the process. And so if you think about all of these chemicals being made bioavailable to the grass, now the grass is healthier. The cattle and the sheep and the chickens eat the grass is healthier, and the chickens eat it. Now the chickens are healthier. And then when we eat them, we get more nutrition and better nutrition just because of the fact that we started with healthy soil. Instead of bringing chemicals through the food chain, we're bringing nutrients through the food chain. Yeah, kind of a big difference.
Mm-hmm. I guess that's really what we believe in the saying, you are what you eat.
It could not be any other way. Is all of the building blocks that make your body, that make you, had to come from somewhere. They were not just magically created by you. They had to be provided from outside sources. So yeah, you are what you eat. Exactly right. Let's drive down over here and let's look at this green patch over here. I'd like for you to see more about what that green patch looks like.
Dark greener. Wow. How many acres is this?
We've got 85 acres under our control here. Between my wife and myself, my son and his wife, and my daughter and her husband.
Oh.
What we did this year, we took a lesson from a guy named Johan Zietsman from Zimbabwe and South Africa. And we put our hay in a particular place, and we let the cattle eat it down, took the hay ring off of it, and let them trample it in real good. And this line that you see here, this dark grass, is where that hay was fed this last winter. And then on top of that, we brought the chicken litter out, and you can see the grass is starting to come up through that chicken litter. And again, it's protecting the soil as well as nourishing the soil.
You think there's a complete science to agriculture?
Most people tend to think of farmers as being simple folk. Farmers are not simple folk. They may not be educated, but they are anything but simple. To be able to understand what it takes to make the land actually healthy and work, is like a combination of agricultural engineering, biology, project management, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, soil science, chemistry, all of it rolled into one. The thing is that people who have grown up on a farm learn many of these things just by being there and doing the work without being educated. One of the real problems that we face today is that in many of our agricultural universities, I'm going to walk back over the shade.
No, you're fine.
In many of our agricultural universities, we have a very strong bias against the way people do regenerative agriculture. One of the things that modern science wants to do, some people call it the mechanistic mindset, some people call it the reductionist mindset. That is, we're going to isolate one single variable. And fundamentally in regenerative agriculture, you'll hear this term holistic. Holistic. It's throughout the literature, throughout the conversations, everywhere. And that's because people have recognized, and successful farmers in many generations have recognized, that you can't separate this from that and isolate one thing, because everything affects everything else. If you take one constituent out, then everything else is going to react to that. If you change one constituent, everything else is going to react to that. And so the techniques, not the principles of science, but the techniques of doing science become an issue. There's a fellow up in South Dakota who worked for the USDA. He has put together a group of folks. There are a couple of requirements for the scientists on his team. One is that they actively run a farm. They cannot be just a scientist. They have to be actively running a farm to be on the team. They are working at developing the techniques for how to study, document, and demonstrate in the scientific literature how these things work or don't work. And they were having some success. I haven't followed up with them in probably 2 or 3 years now, but it was a very exciting thing. Texas A&M used to have a professor who was committed to regenerative agriculture. He used a different term for it, Bjorn somebody or other. He retired a couple years ago, but to my knowledge, Texas A&M does not have anybody on their faculty that is in the least bit interested in regenerative agriculture these days. I would be happy to be wrong about that. If someone knows and would like to tell me differently, I'd be delighted to find out that they have somebody that is supportive of regenerative agriculture. In most cases in the agricultural universities, the first tool in the toolkit is a chemical. I can remember going to conferences and wandering around through the vendor display at the conference, and chemical company, chemical company, chemical company, chemical company, chemical company, a couple of genetics companies, chemical company, chemical company, chemical company. And it just seemed like that was, and in the lecture series, well, if you have this problem, use this chemical. If you have that problem, use this hormone. If you have that problem, use this chemical. And the first line of defense for anything was a chemical. And I was like, there's something wrong with that. There's just something that does not feel right, that the first line of defense is a chemical. It's like, how did this earth survive before 1960 and the rise of chemistry? How did it manage? But it did. Heck of a deal. So yeah, here we are out on a super hot day, although it's beginning to cool just a little bit, at Hood Family Farms, and right now we're surviving our way through the summer.
I'll tell you one thing though. You have a beautiful farm.
Thank you very much.
I'm trying to figure out, so you manage all this with you and your family, and that's it?
Yes.
Cool. Have you always wanted to be a farmer?
The answer is yes and no. I grew up on a ranch in South Texas. I wanted to be a rancher, and at that time in the mid-1970s, ranches were going out of business right and left. There was no real opportunity to make a go of it on the ranch at that particular time, and especially as my father was not ready to step aside and let me take the lead and run the ranch. I wasn't ready, for one thing, at that time, but even if I had been, he would not have done that. That was not his nature. We would have been stuck doing things the old way. And the rise of regenerative agriculture hadn't even happened at that point. So the opportunities just weren't there. So I ended up going off to engineering school, got a mechanical engineering degree, did that for my entire career, and then retired and said, you know, we ought to get some cows. And, you know, it's one of those things where it's always in the future, always in the future. And my wife walked up and she says, why don't we go get some cows? And I said, yeah, we'll do that one day. No, why don't we go get some cows? Yeah, we'll do that one day. She says, no, why don't you go get some cows? You mean like right now? Yeah, I know. So we did. And that's how this all got started. We were a sole proprietorship from 2014 to 2019. And in early 2019, late 2018 is when I made the mental shift from the old ways of doing things to regenerative agriculture. It sounds like it's a simple thing. We're just going to change the way we think and the way we do. There's a fundamental problem in there. You grow up and you look out at something and you say, that is beautiful. That is the way it ought to look. And the question is that a true statement? And the short answer is no, it probably isn't. So like very few animals scattered across a large area is the wrong answer. Would nature do it that way? The answer is no. What would nature do? Nature would have a wolf or a coyote or a mountain lion or a bear or a lion or a leopard bunching the animals into a bunch, and they would do this movement thing. And that is the core principle behind all of regenerative agriculture. We need to mimic what nature does. Now, again, we have to make sure that we apply that based on our local conditions. The principles never change, but the local conditions most definitely do. And just because my conditions are suitable for me on this farm doesn't mean that Larry across the road would have the very same set of principles, because he's got different goals, different objectives for what he wants to do with his property. So his settings on the principles might be a little bit differently. So if you just think about it as a set of knobs that we have, and we all have the same set of knobs, I tweak mine this way, you tweak yours that way, the next guy tweaks his that way, she tweaks her knobs this other way, and we get to the results that we need to get to. There are things like microclimates. There are differences in soil strata. For instance, there's a soil conservation survey, or a soil survey, that the NRCS has available online that will tell you all about the soils around here. And the soils on this place are actually different than the soils across the street. And the soils here are different than the soils up the hill. When we stop and we look at the topography here, we are almost at the bottom of the valley. This is part of the general Mud Creek Valley. We've got a creek off over here to our right, and it's about another 60 feet down to the level of the creek. It was deeper than that before my father-in-law put in the lake, but this has eroded down. That still has not eroded down as much. You know, you can see it's higher land than what we are here.
Right.
And so because it's higher land, what is on top of the ground is different, and what's actually under the ground is different. So if I go all the way down to the end of this paddock, I go from sand 6 or 7 feet deep or deeper to sand that's about 15, 18 inches deep. I know that because digging post holes, trying to dig it with a post hole digger by hand, when you hit that red clay the first time, you know it. It's like hitting rock, ka-wham, and it just sends shivers through your shoulders and back. But over here, I don't have the problem. Soil's different over here than it is 400 yards down. So
Just pretty much.
different places, so all of that you need to take into mind. You need to be aware of it and manage accordingly.
Oh. So let me ask you this. Whenever you have certain soil, would you just adjust your crops to that soil, or would you just dig up the whole thing and try to change it?
You need to adapt your forage and your animals to the soil. Now, if you use native stuff, guess what? The native stuff is already adapted. Before we got here, it had already figured out what was best to grow in this soil.
True.
Those native plants are not here today. They are basically gone. We're going to try to bring some back. Bahia was brought in like the 1930s, 1940s by A&M, and it's basically the standard grass for all of East Texas now. Everywhere it's Bahia. And you don't see little blue stem or big blue stem or Canada wild rye or any eastern gamma grass. You don't see those things except in very, very rare and isolated places. But once upon a time, they were growing out here routinely.
So what kind of grass? So you just want? So do you have your land where you want it to be now?
No.
Are you still moving it?
No, this is a process. So we will change the biology by, number one, using the animals in a particular way to let biodiversity come in. That's one of the reasons why the weeds are not mowed. The weeds are food plants for moths and butterflies and other kinds of things, for insects. Aside from their shelter and shade potential, they will get mowed probably in a couple of weeks. I'm trying to wait for a rain before I do that. And then as we do that, we are looking to see the biodiversity in the forage itself increase. And when the biodiversity increases in the forage, we'll see an increase in the biodiversity in the animals as well. So there's enough of an increase in the biodiversity out here that this year, for the first time ever, I saw a little red bird. I'm trying to remember what his name is. It's not a cardinal. It's more on the order of a finch. I have to go back and look it up. I made a note of it. And then a couple days ago, I saw another little finch type bird with a golden breast and kind of an olive green back. Beautiful little bird, and he flew along with me down the fence for a ways, but I haven't seen those guys before. So we are actually seeing some things come through that we have not seen in the past, and that is a very, very nice thing to see.
Very nice, very nice. Is there any more places to farm on to show me?
Yeah.
Hopefully I'm asking you the right questions. Like, I'm thinking of questions as we're going.
That's all right. I took a little time to write down things that I wanted to make sure that I talked about.
Okay, I wrote down a bunch of questions myself. Now, all your questions, was it a hard start? You get your animals, like the industries and stuff like that. One question I asked you was how you start to spread the diseases, and you said it. We talking about moving animals around, you don't have time, and especially with all the outbreak going on with people not trusting the meat market. I think it was like salmonella got bad at one point with the chicken, and it said people weren't trusting the chicken no more. And then it looks like with the leafy green, was it romaine lettuce? It was bad. Yeah, everybody throwing out romaine lettuce left and right.
Go get your romaine lettuce from YWAM or from Red Moon Farms. John Claude over at YWAM grows his stuff in an aquaponics arrangement, and he uses compost to make a compost tea to feed his plants in his aquaponic arrangement.
Oh, that's smart.
And Red Moon Farms does all their stuff organically. Some good places around, if you just look. That's the key thing that you have to look. It's not going to be in the grocery. some of the difference here. The higher part, drier, less nutritious. The lower part, just a little bit moister, a little bit more nutritious. I can see it.
See, all the main nutrients is at the top of the hill.
Well, they were. One time.
It's coming down.
It's flowing down, so these low spots have more nutrients available. And because the cattle have been in here and all that, their manure has washed down as well. So the nutrients from the manure is also down. This is a lake that my father-in-law built back in about 1962.
How do you build a lake?
You build that great big dam right there.
And just let the water fill up?
Yep. So there's a creek there.
Ooh. Wow.
And even in 2011, the driest year that I know of out here, the creek that feeds this never stopped running.
You ever come out here and just stare at the lake?
Yeah. 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 My mother-in-law sold the place a couple years ago, so the far side of the lake is no longer ours, but we do still retain a part of the lake. And, we use the water from the lake to water our animals.
Can I ask you a question?
Mm-hmm.
You come out here and look at the lake. Do you just be thinking about your farm, or you just think about a bunch of stuff that you've done in your past?
Yes. It just depends on the day.
What do you consider to be your greatest accomplishment?
I was asking myself the question about what, looking back on my life, what are my priorities? Let's just look at my track record. What are my priorities? My priority number one has been to be a good husband. Priority number two has been to be a good father. Those things are evident in the choices I've made about career, choices I've made about spending, choices I've made about extracurricular activities. Okay? Beyond that, I've been a successful engineer. Got 3 patents. If you were to go look at an Eagle bus, which became Dina, I could walk you into that bus today and show you, see that right there? I designed that in 1983 or 1984, and it's still there today. If I were to take you to a Bluebird school bus, I could walk you into the Bluebird school bus and say, you see that right there? I and my team designed that, and it's still here. After what now? 1988, 12, 23, 35 years. So those things from an engineering perspective, I'm proud of. We did some good work. Out here on the farm, we managed to build a house with our own hands. We did about 65% of the work on our house. I did the framing on the lower floor 100% by myself. My father and I hung all the windows. I did most of the drywall myself. So lots and lots of stuff like that. Just learning by doing. And I guess one of the things that I think that I like about myself is that I really haven't ever seen anything that I said, I cannot do that. I might say I choose not to do that. I don't want to expend the effort. But there are a few things that I've said I cannot. Now, in terms of physical things, I cannot go jump like Vince Carter. I can't shoot like Michael Jordan. I'm not that. But at the same time, had I ever built a house before? No. Well, all right, let's figure it out.
Right.
Have I ever programmed one of these things before? No, I haven't. Well, let's figure it out. Have I ever been a farmer before? No. Well, let's figure it out. So the can-do perspective on life, for me, is one of the things that I am most satisfied with about my own character.
That was wonderful. Well, as it is, when you look back on your life, do you have any regrets or no?
I think that very few people in this world can look back on their life and say they have no regrets and not be telling a lie. There are choices that I made that would have maybe made my relationship with my wife even better than it is, or my relationship with my kids better than they are. There are choices that I made financially that I know for a fact would have made me probably a millionaire, if not a multimillionaire by now, if I hadn't been stupid and impatient. Okay, fine. Do I cry about it? No. Those things are done, and you deal with the results and move on to the next thing. Use those things as teaching opportunities, and don't make the same mistake again.
I can see that. What would you be considered? Are you at peace with yourself?
I am. I'm trying to remember exactly how the Apostle Paul put it. I would say, I am contented, but I am not satisfied. And by that I mean, I am happy with my life, and I'm happy to be where I am today. At the same time, I want to be better tomorrow than I am today. I want to be better as a business analyst. I want to be better as an engineer. I want to be better as a human being, most of all, tomorrow than I am today. There's an endless supply of opportunities that come our way to simply take a few seconds and think about what you said, think about what you did, regardless of the context, whether it's as husband, as father, as friend, as acquaintance, as employee, as employer, as just a person cruising through life. What could I have done differently, and what would the likely outcomes have been if I had done it differently? What can I learn from that? Where can I look to find out what the possibilities are or what the likelihoods are? And being willing to actually ask the questions and do the research is a big deal. A lot of people in this world are not willing to ask the questions, much less willing to do the research to find out what the implications of their choices actually are. They will keep doing the things that they've done time and time and time again. And he's like, do you not understand that your framework for making decisions is not quite right? It keeps leading you to these bad places. They don't get it. They keep making the same bad decisions.
Isn't that the meaning of insanity?
Albert Einstein would suggest that is one of the meanings of insanity. Absolutely. You keep doing the same thing and expect a different outcome. So if you really truly want things to change, you can't just sit back and whine about it or cry about it. You have to own the things that you've done, take responsibility for them, and if you don't like the outcomes, change. And that sounds super simple, but again, like changing the mindset for how we manage livestock, changing our mindset is one of the hardest things in the world to do. And my own personal experience is that it takes a traumatic experience to cause someone to actually make that change. Whether it's a near-death experience, or it's a religious ecstasy experience, or something in between. It takes something that is profoundly traumatic, something that turns your entire life upside down to get people to think differently. Not very many people are able to do it otherwise. Unfortunately, that's the case. Charles Massey was talking about Australia, where he lives. When he started his journey into regenerative agriculture, he said that he began to ask the question, why did you change from doing it that way to doing it this regenerative way? And he said in almost every case, there was a life trauma. They were about to lose the farm. Somebody died. This happened, that happened. But it was the traumatic experience that made them able to shift their thinking patterns. I would hope that people can make the shift without having to go through trauma. Mass trauma is usually accompanied by violence, hunger, revolution, other kinds of things that we don't really like to have happen to us.
True.
So we don't want mass trauma. No. Individual, okay, fine. But better, sit down with yourself and get honest with yourself and make the changes.
Like you said, it's not that easy.
That's right. But it's a funny thing, because in the engineering world, the first solution is almost never the right solution or the solution you end up with. And the first solution is almost always much more complex than the solution you end up with. My first vice president of engineering way back when said, any idiot can make it complicated. He said, our goal is to make it simple, to make it inexpensive, and to make it robust. The common wisdom says you can't do all three. You can do two, but you can't do all three. He said, we will do elegant design, we'll do all three. And that was in like 1983 or 1984, and that stuck with me all these years. But the thing is, just that. It may be simple, but it takes work. The thing is, if you want change, do the work. That's it. Just do the work. Make the change. It will be work. It won't be easy, because it's like when I look out here, I see this and I go, ooh, that's pretty. But it is not the ideal. I need animals bunched up, moving across out there.
You see the overall what you want, not just the part you see.
One of the things that I've been blessed with is the ability to see things from the, let's call it the 30,000 foot level, and then move into the detail. Some people start at the detail and then have to move to the 30,000 foot. Experience says to me that either way can be very effective, but it's actually harder to move forward if you go from the detail to the general rather than from the general to the detail. So if you say, here's the picture of what I want, how do I get there? I can start to build a path to get from here to there. But if I start with the details, all I see is a forest.
True.
And how do I find my way through the forest to get to the thing that I want? Do I even know what I want? That's the question. If you start with the details, sometimes it's much harder than that. I have known people who've done that very effectively. I'm not saying that it can't be done. It's just harder. One of my colleagues and I had a good bit of conflict because he saw things from the detail up, I saw things from the top down. When we figured out how we were each wired, we were able to work effectively much better, because I could appreciate where he was coming from, he could appreciate where I was coming from. And so for me, it's like, okay, we want a farm that does these things. All right, let's sit down and write a plan for how we're going to get there. And if the plan doesn't work, change the plan.
Do you think the world just needs a better understanding of itself? You think we'll never come to an understanding?
I think that civilized people, people in largely urban societies, have more problem in that respect than people who live in more agrarian societies. This is my own observation. So you can call it anecdotal. People can call me an idiot. That's okay. But if I look at the agrarian societies, they are living close to the land. They understand the earth's heartbeat. They understand if they don't do things in a particular way, they get bad results. In an urban environment, if you throw trash out, big deal. You see no effect. If you do this or you do that, you throw this in the trash, you throw that in the trash, you tear this down, you build that up, you don't see the effects.
Mm.
From the perspective of someone living in the city, what does it mean to get food? It means go to the store and buy it, or call somebody to have it brought to you.
Mm.
It doesn't have anything to do with the difficulties of actually raising an animal or raising a plant. And consequently, from their perspective, it's like you snap your fingers, it's supposed to be there. It don't work that way. It just doesn't. The idea that you could say, well, you're going to raise this many cattle on this many acres of land, well, what happens when, like this year, it doesn't rain? What happens like it did a couple of years ago when it rained a lot? And, so you have these extremes, and all of a sudden, things are not optimum. And again, I think that the people living in urban societies, being divorced from the land in that way, do not appreciate the heartbeat of the earth. The temperatures in the city over the streets are like 20 or 25 degrees hotter, maybe more, than the temperatures over the top of the grass out here.
I believe it.
And we build more and more and more stuff and cover it over with concrete and asphalt, and we soak in all this solar radiation. And we were just talking about how things radiate out.
Mm-hmm.
The sun hits that black concrete, the concrete absorbs it, and then it emits it back out as infrared radiation, as heat. So you're basically walking on a heat lamp if you walk across the street. In the cold wintertime, snakes understand this real well, because they'll crawl out on the road because it's radiating that heat back out. It's warmer than the surrounding air, just because of that. If you then take into account water, when rain falls on grass or on trees, it's ultimately going to get down to the soil and get soaked into the soil. When enough of it lands, it's going to run off into the creeks. What happens in the city? What happens in the city, the rain falls, it lands on a piece of concrete or a piece of asphalt, it does not have any chance to get soaked into the soil at all. And so that soil, under all that construction, is powder dry. There's no water in there, not unless you dig down pretty deep, because the water just can't get there.
I don't know. I just don't think, like you said earlier, about the way you're talking about the topsoil and the way the world's going. We keep building stuff every day.
That's right. Now, if you concentrate that,
Okay, sorry.
if you concentrate that water, and it's not having any chance to soak into the ground, what happens in the city? Okay, so you have these water running down the streets. It runs into a drainage opening, and it drains through some drain, and it gets concentrated, and then now you've got this 14-inch pipe coming out that's roaring with water. Next thing you know, you've got a 6-foot pipe that's roaring a flood. Next thing you know, you've got this raging river that used to be a placid little creek, and this is for a small rain, much less a big rain. What's happening to the water cycle? The water's not going into the ground, it's going off down to the sea. It's not staying where it's supposed to stay. It's like one of the fundamental principles in all this stuff is try to keep the water at the highest possible point so that it has a chance to go in at the highest point, and gravity will do the rest, move it down through the rest of the soil automatically. Gravity's a wonderful thing if you let it work for you. It's a horrible thing if you don't.
True. I want to ask you this. Would it be hard for someone to have like a little small garden like in their backyard?
Not at all. One of the things that happened in World War II is that people were encouraged to grow gardens in their homes, and whether it was an apartment or a small house or a large house, people were growing gardens all over the place. And very few people actually went hungry during that time. Not only that, but they had pretty nutritious food, because the soils that they were using to raise their crops were actually healthy soils. They weren't treated with chemicals. So what could you do? Let's say you have 2 hands, and you've got some plants in the backyard, you take your kitchen scraps after every meal
Mm.
and you feed them to the chickens. What does the chicken do with that? The chicken is going to eat it, the chicken's going to poop, and the chicken's going to lay an egg. Okay? This is great. There's breakfast tomorrow. Now, that poop and the litter that poop falls on, if you, like we use wood chips, you can then use to make compost to feed your garden, and now you can make this a closed loop cycle with a couple of chickens and a few flower pots. I mean, the fundamentals are not at all difficult, and people in the 40s were doing it left and right. And then we've consolidated since then to the point now that very, very few people would even consider doing that.
Where do you see the world in 20 years?
Where do I see the world in 20 years? I think that there are two possibilities and not a lot in between. In 20 years, if, especially we as the United States, don't get our act together and remember that we are all Americans, and that this country is actually worth something, then we are going to have a civil war, and we will be 2 or 3 nations. And the division will probably be East Coast, Central, and West Coast. Then that's kind of the scenario in a mini series called Man in the High Castle.
Hmm.
It's built on the supposition that Japan and the Nazis won World War II, but that was the division in North America: East, Central, and West. I could easily see that happening if we don't get it together. The second thing is that we do, in fact, decide that it's better to be together than apart, and begin to actually work together to change some of these things. We have the ability to begin the process of slowing down climate change. Alan Savory is very, very adamant that climate change is not actually the worst problem. His perspective is that the worst problem is desertification. And when I look at the evidence that I can find, I have to agree with him. Desertification is the issue because the loss of grass retaining carbon dioxide and putting it back into the soil, the loss of grass allowing more heat to hit the land and then be reflected back like a heater, this is amplifying the cycle that we call climate change. When the grass is gone, then we have less ability to hold the water, and the water runs off down to the sea. And so I don't have as much moisture to grow things in this location. So these are all doable things. And in the best case scenario, we decide that we will change the way we think and change the way we act, and we start to make it happen. You know, in some places it's about letting forests grow again. In other places it's about letting the grasslands grow again. Why would it not be forests in the Sahara, or along the edge of the Sahara? Well, the answer is it takes a heck of a lot more water to grow a forest than it does to grow grassland. That's the reason why the grasslands of the world were much more vast than the forests of the world, and they were both much vaster in the past than they are today. They are what they are now almost entirely due to human activity. Cutting trees, plowing grass, abusing the land with our livestock, all those things, those can be changed. And it is as simple as changing the way people think and manage, and it is as difficult as changing the way people think and manage. Simple and difficult oftentimes go together.
I believe it. Okay, I have a problem with thinking very complex, and I try to make it simple, and I run into so many barriers.
The world is complex, and I don't remember whether Savory or Salatin made this particular observation. Said, a computer is complicated. computer's complicated. Neural networks are a different thing, but
Right.
the run-of-the-mill computer is complicated in that it has a set of instructions, and it will follow those instructions to the letter. Always. It's deterministic. And while it's very complicated, it may be hard to figure out what it did and why it did it. It was following an instruction. Boom, boom, boom. A, B, C, D, E. Right down the line, and it did that. Biology, the natural world, is not complicated. It's complex. And by complex, I mean it's not deterministic. You cannot say that if you do 1, 2, 3, 4, this is going to be the output. Life just doesn't work that way. It just doesn't. There are so many nuances to life. Stimulus and response, slight differentiations of this concentration, that concentration, this humidity level, that humidity level, this heat level, that heat level, all of it combining simultaneously to produce a result, but not so that you can say, I have the conditions exactly the same as I did the time before, and I will get exactly the same result, which is why when they do like pharmacological studies and things of that nature, they do statistical analyses because they can hold the conditions the same and they get different results.
Mm.
Now, they may tend to clump here or clump there, but the results are not always the same. And that's what's meant when they say the natural world is complex, not complicated. Machinery, electronics, that's complicated. It's deterministic.
That was very nice. I always said the world's made for a simple mind, I feel.
In some respects, taking it as it is, with just a simple perspective, this is the way the world is and this is the way the world works. Thank you very much. That's all I need to know. Get you there faster. When you start trying to decompose a complex system the way many of our agricultural scientists want to do, you end up chasing
Rabbit holes.
phantoms. Basically, you're chasing rabbit trails, and you can't get there because you've decomposed a complex system. It's not complicated. It's not deterministic. It is complex and non-deterministic, and so it has to be treated as a whole. And the idea of treating it as a whole goes against not the scientific principle per se, but by the accepted scientific dogma, the accepted scientific methodology. Again, as I said earlier, there are people who are working to develop a different methodology to account for understanding complexity without trying to decompose it and consequently make it irrelevant.
Mm.
This is a very peaceful time of day. The lake is like a mirror. If you were to go down there onto the lake, you'd be able to see 3 or 4 feet down into the water. The water's so clear. Very, very healthy lake. We've got good vegetation in there to feed the fish.
You consider this like a perfect ecosystem?
I don't know about perfect, but it's healthy. It's healthy. We do have to be concerned about runoff from upstream.
Mm.
And I don't know what they do up there. There may be chemicals coming into the lake that I'm unaware of. I don't think there's much going in up there. I know there's probably some. And then there's going to be some manure load going in. But at the same time, there's a lot of grass upstream from us. And that grass is a fantastic filter. Mm. And you see the weeds growing around the lake.
Mm-hmm.
That is nature's filtration system. That's what nature put there to take the nasties out of the water.
Mm.
And so you see a good rim all the way around the lake. It's doing what it's supposed to do.
I got 2 more questions for you.
Yes, sir.
What is like the day-to-day life for you?
Day-to-day life. As I said at the farmer's market, my wife told me one day that, Robin, you're bored. You need to go get a job. I had retired at that point, full-time farmer. And she said, you're bored. What? I've seen this before. You're bored. Go get a job. So I did. So I work as a business analyst for the National Restaurant Association, working in the finance team, translating business stuff to computer stuff. That's what I do day to day. And then I have the second job of working with the family here on the farm. My job in the farm, my responsibilities are primarily to provide leadership, vision, and I do all of the financial and accounting work.
Mm-hmm.
The different things that you see, like the fencing systems, the solar systems, the chicken houses and all that, the corrals, I designed those, my mechanical engineering skills.
So everything came back full circle.
Oh yeah. Everything that I've ever done in my life has been of value out here on the farm.
That's wonderful, man.
And then there's still time from time to time to go sit down and eat dinner with my daughter and her family, or to take a trip to Houston and visit with my son, or just to sit down and chill.
I wanted to ask you, when you were a kid, what was your biggest dream?
To be a rancher.
So you always,
In terms of career, that was it. The other dream, and as I said before, if I look at the evidence of my life and I think back to the dreams that I had for myself as a teenager, being a husband and a parent was number one. That has always been number one.
Oh, where do you see your farm in 5 years?
Well, in 5 years, I will be much less a part of it. So, we talked a little bit earlier about my father not really wanting to hand over control of the farm. Well, I'm 67 years old. I am well past the time when I should have handed off the leadership of the farm to the next generation. That said, the next generation wasn't there at that point in time. At 60, we hadn't even conceived of doing this in the first place. So now we are in the process of transitioning to the next generation. And that is an exciting time for me to hand it off to younger leadership, different ideas, different level of energy, and then step back into the role of advisor to answer questions, pitch in where I need to pitch in. Maybe go on a road trip.
I believe it. I believe it. Well, I got one more question. I promise you I'm done. What's the biggest life thing you've learned on your journey?
It's not about the destination. It is never about the destination. When we're young,
Oh my God.
we think it's about the destination. We think it's about, I need to achieve this. I need to get to that level. I need to accomplish this. And those are important things. Ambition is a good thing within limits. But if you do that without taking the time to appreciate the journey, you've wasted your time. Those years that you do that, they're just wasted. Because you look back on them and you're like, I wonder what happened then. Wow, a lot of time passed. I wonder what happened. Oh wow, those kids grew up they're wow, guys are as tall as I am now. He was this tall when I saw him last. The investment in the journey itself is the most important thing. That's a mistake that I made early on, and I would love to see other people not make that mistake. And again, I'm not saying don't have ambition, don't strive for excellence, but understand what your priorities in life are. Tom Peters, back in the day, had a book called In Search of Excellence, and at one of their conferences, somebody asked, well, how does this fit with like going to my daughter's soccer game? And the response was, the time that you could have invested in being excellent you wasted by going to that daughter's soccer game. And I would say that is the most egregious violation of humanity that was ever uttered. Not to invest in one's children is a horrible thing, a simply horrible thing. The idea that your work is more important than this life that you brought into this world, that's a horrible thing. From my perspective, that choice is the moral equivalent of child sacrifice. You have sacrificed your child on the altar of success. Unacceptable in my book.
I see that.
And I would counsel people, don't do that. Strive for excellence, but understand what your priorities in life are. Honor the journey. If you have a spouse, if you have children, they need to be your priorities. There are very few people in this world that can do otherwise. You know, probably the most successful businessman in the last 150 years would be Elon Musk. Okay? Elon has made the decision to a large degree to sacrifice his personal relationships on the altar of success. Now, we are reaping great benefits as humanity because he made that decision. But what does it mean to his ex-wives? What does it mean to his children? What about them? That's an investment that I would never have made. I'll never be an Elon, therefore. And so I will honor his decision, but I would say that's a questionable decision.
That was deep. That was deep.
You can think out here on the farm every now and then.
I can tell. I've been thinking about life for a good minute since we've been out here on this farm. Got me feel like I need to do better with my life. Start striving for more. I just feel like I'm my worst enemy. That's where I'm at.
That's usually the case. We are our own worst enemies. I remember, I can nerd out on things real easy, but we talked about this holistic thing, and you got all these dials, and everybody's got the same set of dials, and you just tweak the knobs differently. Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I'm of the opinion that very few people in this world have different components in their value system. And again, it's like a set of dials, and one person has the dial set this way, another person has the dial set that way. And the result of the settings on the dials means that the answer is different. So if the answer is not the answer that you want, change the setting on the dials. And that means that you have to take enough time to understand yourself, to know what your value system actually is, what really matters to you. Okay, there are two things that will tell you about what matters to you more than anything else. Your time and your wallet. Where do you spend your time? And where do you spend your money? That's where your priorities are. And it will not lie. Ever. You want to know what your priorities are? You can tell yourself all kinds of lies all day long. Go look at where you spend your time. Keep a log. Go pull out your checkbook. Pull out your credit card register. See where you spent your money. It'll tell you where your priorities are. Is your priority being a good financial steward? Your spending will tell you whether that is a priority for you or not. You may say, I'm working to be a great financial steward. Checkbook might agree, or it might not. I want to prioritize my relationship with my son and my daughter and my wife. Okay, great. Where do you spend your time? I went golfing yesterday, and I'm going to go golfing day after tomorrow, and I'm going to golf 4 times this week. Maybe that's not the best expenditure of your time. Perhaps you should be spending some time with them. So little things like that, time and money, they won't lie to you. As a matter of fact, they will force you to be honest with yourself if you let them.
You learn a lot on this journey, haven't you?
I've been at this for 67 years, man.
Oh,
I'm philosophical by nature. My wife will tell you that.
it gets on my nerves. It's like it's every day. It's something you just wonder and ponder all day, don't you?
Mhm.
You don't get annoyed?
Sometimes. When I was in my 30s, I especially got annoyed. And by the time I got to my 50s, I realized that getting annoyed is the wrong answer.
It doesn't help.
It doesn't help. It doesn't help one little bit. And so if I get annoyed, it's like, okay, I'm annoyed. Now, why am I annoyed and what am I going to do about it? That's the question. What am I annoyed about and why am I am I going to do about it? Most of the time, my annoyance is going to come from some miscommunication somewhere. I've said something or I've done something that someone else has not understood or appreciated correctly. And I can say, well, they should have understood. That's not on them. It's on me to be clear. I need to own it. And so if I am annoyed, I need to understand why I'm annoyed. I need to own that as my problem, not somebody else's problem. The moment that I take ownership of it, it becomes solvable. If I don't take ownership of it, it is not solvable.
Oh my goodness.
Think about it.
I know that's making me mad. I'm like, oh my goodness, man. You're doing the one thing people don't like to do. They don't like to admit that they're wrong.
Well, admitting that you're wrong is hard. But the most influential, best businessman, richest man in the world has said publicly on more than one occasion, I welcome negative criticism because I make mistakes. He said that. He does not believe that he is perfect, no more than I believe that I'm perfect. I make plenty of mistakes most days. Most of us do. Own it, learn from it, move on. In a relationship, a lot of people, when we got married, we were talking about, we're going to have this 50-50 relationship. You know what? A 50-50 relationship doesn't work. It never works. It just doesn't. You know what relationship works? 100-100. And anything other than 100-100 doesn't work nearly as well. I'm responsible for cleaning up the kitchen. I'm responsible for making the bed. I'm responsible for this and that and the next thing. But my wife is likewise responsible. And she takes her responsibilities seriously. And we come to an agreement about where the work splits occur. But if it doesn't get done, it's not because she didn't do her job. It's upon me to get the job done. It's not like, well, that's not my job. In a relationship, that should never, ever enter the conversation. Not if you want it to go the distance. We've been married for, what'll it be this year? This year it will be 46 years.
Congratulations.
So there's a lot of learning that goes into 46 years of marriage.
Is it easy for you to forgive yourself?
No. Got to do it, but it ain't easy.
Dadgummit. I hope people feel like, it's easy. No, I did X, Y, and Z. That's my problem. I feel like all my things are like one singular answer.
And, it's like, if I allow myself, I can go back to things that I did as a teenager and feel all of the guilt and shame for things that I did that I shouldn't have done all over again. Is that productive? No. So you learn, it's a skill, you learn how to set it aside and say, fine. You think about the voice on your shoulder, the good voice, the bad voice kind of a thing, and that's the bad voice talking in your ear. You say, shut up and go away. I'm going to listen to this guy over here for a while. And move on. And say, fine. Just stop the mind chatter and move on. Go do something productive. And again, that's a skill. Anybody can learn how to do it. Once again, it's not easy, but it is simple. And the ducks have come down to visit us.
Got me wanting to get a farm.
There are a lot of worse things in life.
Don't do me like that.
I mean, I could live in a city. That would be worse.
Goodness, man.
Not really. We lived in town for a long, long time before we moved out here. But we've been out here for, what, almost 30 years now. 28 years.
If you could do it all over again, would you still be a farmer?
Yeah, absolutely. There is value in doing this. There's value in feeling the heartbeat of the earth. There's value in understanding it well enough to teach somebody else how to appreciate it.
I can see. Man. I don't even know. So when you officially retire, what's your plan? Just to sit at the house on the porch and just enjoy nature? Or do you think you're going to go on another psychological journey?
I'll probably get a Cybertruck and start traveling around the country.
Any places you want to go?
I want to go to Mount Rushmore, Glacier National Park, Yosemite. I want to go up to Mount Rainier. I want to see Seattle and a bunch of the islands up there. I just want to go tour around the country and see things that I haven't seen before.
Either I go to any foreign countries?
I'd like to go to Peru and see Cusco and some of the places like that. I might like to go to some of the other great archaeological sites in the world. I was talking to my wife yesterday about going to South Africa, where they found human remains that are something like 3 million years old, 4 million years old, at the bottom of vertical caves.
Oh.
Yeah. And so for the longest time they thought all of the paleontology was going to be done in the Olduvai Gorge over in the Tanzania, Kenya area. But then they found all this stuff in South Africa and opened up a whole new front in the world of paleontology. And then they started finding humans that were actually not that old, like maybe 50, 60,000 years old, maybe even younger than that, from places like the Philippines and the islands out there that are like 3 feet tall. Little people.
That's amazing.
Yes. And different islands had different species of these humans. It's like, wait a minute, how did they get there? There's water between here and there. And there's no evidence that anybody knew how to make a boat in those days, but how did they get from here to there? They did.
When there's a will, there's a way.
Did you ever see Jurassic Park?
Yes.
What is it that Jeff Goldblum says when somebody's saying we've taken all these precautions to keep the animals from breeding?
Doesn't it like nature will find a way?
He said, life always finds a way.
Life will.
And that's the thing. Life finds a way. The strongest force on the planet is life. Not technology. It's life. Charles Massey goes in one of his videos, goes through a bunch of calculations and talks about carbon and how much carbon we're talking about. And he are you familiar with Ayers Rock, Uhuru in Australia?
No,
the big rock in the center of Australia?
No, sir.
Okay. It's like a 1 cubic mile of rock. Okay. A mile up, a mile down, and a mile wide. Okay. a cubic mile of rock. And how many bricks of that size does it take to get the carbon out of the atmosphere that we say we need to get out of the atmosphere? And he goes through all of this big long thing. And if you've ever seen the climate change stuff, they talk about the Laffer curve, and it comes up like this, and it's, a lot of times they show this little jaggy line on it, and the jaggy line is the annual variation in the carbon dioxide level in the air. What makes the carbon dioxide go up and down? What makes the carbon dioxide go up and down is the growth of the forests in the northern hemisphere, what they refer to as the boreal forests, not the tropical rainforests, but the forests in the temperate zone. Why does it vary up and down? The green leaves come out and they suck carbon dioxide out of the air, and it goes down. But then it comes the fall, and all the leaves fall off, and they fall on the ground, and there's not enough animals to incorporate them into the soil, so they just decay and give their carbon dioxide back to the air. But the problem is, while they were doing that in the natural cycle, we were adding to that with our cars and all the other stuff that we burn. But life has the ability to suck this much stuff out of the air, and we're only talking about the boreal forest. What happens if we restore the grasslands? Well, there's approximately 1 billion acres of grasslands that could be restored reasonably. If we were to restore that, we would drop the carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere appreciably, and we would do it without having to alter the world through technology. We would just let life do what life is supposed to do, and we would literally restore the carbon cycle to places where it has been disrupted. And again, Charles Massey is a guy who does some really, really great work in that area. Massy, I believe, is his last name. He's a sheep farmer, and as I mentioned earlier, he went on the journey to find out why people chose regenerative agriculture. He's written a book called The Call of the Reed Warbler, a little bird that was thought to be extinct. And as they did regenerative agriculture and their lands came back, all of a sudden the bird showed up. Oh yeah, the birds showed up, and that's like, this is super cool. It's like I was talking about birds showing up out here. As we increase the biodiversity, we make the land healthier, then stuff will show up. So that's it.
Good Lord. I love it.
Those things right there were destroyed by a windstorm, and I've got to, as it cools off this fall, they will get deconstructed.
You want to use them for something else? Yeah.
It's like that roof on the big one is almost perfectly intact. I got a place for that.
Sound like a plan.
You betcha.
Man, thank you so much again.
Chris, thank you very much. I appreciate taking the time.
No problem, man. Thank you.